The desert stretched for miles, an endless barren expanse where the sun bled red into the horizon. The highway was empty, the kind of road that swallowed cars and left only ghosts behind. Frank Delaney, an old Marine with more scars than stories, leaned against his dust-caked truck, wiping the sweat from his brow. The damn thing had given up on him, right outside the worst possible place, a roadside bar known as the Viper's Nest. Frank had been through this stretch of desert before, knew what kind of people ran through here. Rough men, desperate men, the kind that smelled weakness the way a wolf sniffed out blood. He adjusted his jacket, his fingers brushing over the faded Marine Corps patch on his sleeve. He wasn't weak, he wasn't afraid, but he also wasn't stupid. The sound of motorcycles tore through the silence. He didn't turn to look. He could feel them, a dozen or more, rolling in like a pack of jackals, engines growling like something hungry. The first bike skidded to a stop beside his truck, then another, and another. Frank finally looked up. The Black Reapers. Hello, Mr. Pictures here. Please subscribe to the channel as it allows me to continue posting these stories. Thank you. Now back to the video. Leather vests, tattooed hands, greasy hair, scarred faces that had seen too many fights and walked away from most of them. At the center of the group, Crusher, their leader, climbed off his massive Harley. A man built like a wrecking ball, his arms like tree trunks, his knuckles wrapped in scar tissue, his beady eyes locked onto Frank, and a slow, knowing grin spread across his face. Well, well, Crusher said, mocking amusement in his tone. What do we got here? A couple of the bikers chuckled, a low, mean sound. Frank said nothing. He just stood there, unmoving. Crusher walked up to him, close enough that Frank could smell the whiskey on his breath. You lost, old man? Frank exhaled, slow and even. Just waiting on a tow. Crusher glanced at the truck, then at the empty road behind them. Yeah, looks like you're waiting a long time. The men around him laughed. Frank knew this game. He had seen it before in places far worse than this. Men like these didn't want an answer. They wanted a reaction. Crusher reached out and tapped the Marine patch on Frank's sleeve. This real old man, or just something you wear to get free coffee at the diner? The laughter came again, louder this time. Frank stayed still. His silence seemed to irritate Crusher. The big man's smirk twitched, and then, with no warning, he snatched Frank's cap off his head and tossed it onto the dirt. A long, heavy silence followed. The world seemed to pause, hanging in the balance. Frank didn't move right away. He just looked at his cap lying in the dirt, the same cap he had worn for years, its faded brim soaked with sweat, blood, and time. Then he looked back up, and something shifted. The bikers felt it. The laughter died. Crusher's grin faltered, because suddenly, it didn't feel like they were in control anymore. Frank bent down, slow and deliberate, picking up his cap. He dusted it off, placed it back onto his head, and adjusted it carefully. Then, without breaking eye contact with Crusher, he pulled out his old flip phone and dialed a number. Crusher raised an eyebrow. Who the hell you calling, Grandpa? Frank pressed the phone to his ear, listening as it rang once, twice. Then someone picked up. Frank's voice was calm, cold, final. Yeah, he said. I need a little backup. Silence. Then, a voice on the other end. How many? Frank's lips curled just slightly. A dozen, maybe more. Shouldn't take long. Crusher's smirk returned, but now there was something forced behind it. That's supposed to scare me? Frank closed the phone and put it away. Then he met Crusher's eyes. It should. The air grew heavy, thick with something darker than the night settling in around them. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. Frank just stood there, waiting, because he knew what was coming. And when it arrived, these boys were going to wish they had picked someone else to mess with. The wind had picked up, whistling through the open highway, sending dust swirling around the parked bikes. The tension hung thick in the air, pressing down like a storm about to break. The bikers were no longer grinning, no longer sneering at the old Marine standing calmly in their midst. Crusher's jaw twitched as he stared at Frank, his amusement quickly wearing thin. The silence was working against him, and he didn't like it. Men like him survived on control, the ability to intimidate, to make others flinch. But Frank Delaney? Frank wasn't flinching. Who the hell did you just call? Crusher asked, taking a step closer, his boots scraping against the pavement. Frank's gaze didn't waver. "Back up!" The way he said it, so simple, so certain, sent a ripple of unease through the gang. The younger bikers exchanged glances. A couple of them shifted on their feet, suddenly feeling the weight of the heat, the remoteness of the road. Crusher scoffed. "That right?" He turned to his men, spreading his arms. "Well, guess what, Grandpa? I got backup too." With a quick motion, he reached inside his leather vest and pulled out a switchblade, flicking it open with a metallic snap. Around him, his gang followed suit, knives glinting, fists tightening, the promise of violence hanging in the air like an electric charge. Frank exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Dumb move," Crusher snarled. "You don't get to talk, old man." He stepped forward, rolling his shoulders like a prizefighter stepping into a ring. "See, I don't like waiting, so I think we'll settle this before your little backup gets here." Frank watched him, unblinking, then rolled back his sleeve, revealing a scarred forearm and a simple black tattoo, a faded emblem of the 1st Recon Battalion, United States Marine Corps. One of the younger bikers, tall, lanky, with nervous eyes, recognized it first, his face drained of color. "Crusher? That's a Recon patch." Crusher didn't seem to hear him, or maybe he just didn't care. "I don't give a damn if he's the president. We're finishing this." Frank tilted his head slightly, listening. Then he smiled. Far in the distance, barely audible beneath the desert wind, came the sound of engines. Not motorcycles, trucks, big ones. The bikers turned toward the road, frowning, trying to see through the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of highway and the distant flicker of heat mirages. Then the headlights appeared. 1, 2, 5, a convoy. The lead truck was a modified military-style Jeep, its high beams cutting through the night. Behind it, a matte black pickup, engine snarling like something alive. And behind that, more bikes. Not like the ones belonging to Crusher's gang. These were leaner, stripped-down machines built for speed, for war. Crusher's sneer faltered. "Who the hell is that?" Frank didn't answer. He just crossed his arms and waited. The convoy rolled in fast, kicking up dust, the engines growling like something primal. The first Jeep braked hard, skidding slightly before coming to a dead stop. The pickup pulled up right beside Frank's truck, the door already swinging open before the wheels had even stopped turning. And then he stepped out. A massive man, broad-shouldered, built like a tank, covered in old military tattoos. His beard was thick, peppered with gray, his eyes sharp as a blade. Reaper. Former Marine, former Black Ops, leader of the Ghost Company. He took one look at Frank, then at the bikers surrounding him. His expression didn't change. "Jesus, Frank," he muttered, rubbing his jaw. "You always find trouble, or does it just follow you?" Frank smirked. "Just stretching my legs." Behind Reaper, more men stepped out of the vehicles. Not just bikers, ex-military combat vets, men with the kind of presence that sent alarms through even the most hardened criminals. Crusher finally understood. His gang wasn't the biggest thing in the desert tonight. "You got about 10 seconds, Reaper said, stepping forward, "to get on your bikes and disappear. Otherwise, this turns ugly." Crusher looked around, searching for some kind of advantage, some way to save face. But there was none. The numbers had flipped. The balance had shifted, and the Black Reapers were suddenly prey. Frank tilted his head at Crusher. "I'd listen to him. He's less patient than me." Crusher gritted his teeth, his jaw flexing, but deep down, he knew he had lost. With a sharp motion, he turned to his men. "Get your bikes, we're done here." The Black Reapers didn't argue. They moved fast, scrambling onto their bikes, some of them glancing over their shoulders at the Ghost Company, like they had just seen ghosts for real. Engines fired up, tires screeched against the asphalt. Within moments, they were gone, disappearing down the highway, their tail lights shrinking into the night. Silence settled over the desert again. Reaper turned to Frank. "You gonna tell me what that was about?" Frank picked up his cap from where it had fallen, dusted it off, and placed it back on his head. "Just some kids who needed a lesson." Reaper shook his head, exhaling. "You could have called me sooner, you stubborn bastard." Frank smirked. "Would have ruined the fun." Reaper laughed, clapping Frank on the back. "You're buying the next round." Fair deal, Frank said, climbing into his truck. As the convoy turned back toward the road, the desert stretched ahead, endless and quiet once more. But somewhere, far down that empty stretch of highway, the Black Reapers were riding hard, shaken, knowing that tonight they had come real close to something they didn't understand. And they would never make that mistake again. The rumble of the retreating motorcycles faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast stretch of desert highway. The Black Reapers were gone, but the night still felt heavy, charged with the weight of what had just happened. Frank Delaney exhaled slowly, rubbing his fingers together like he was shaking off an old habit. Reaper stood beside him, watching the dust settle. His men, the Ghost Company, remained by their vehicles, their trained eyes sweeping the horizon, scanning for threats the way they had been trained to in battle. Even now, years out of the service, old instincts never died. "You know," Reaper finally said, rolling his shoulders, "I should be pissed at you for dragging us all the way out here." Frank smirked, adjusting his cap. "I figured you boys could use a little fresh air." Reaper shook his head, laughing under his breath. "You ever stop being an ornery bastard?" Frank tilted his head, thinking. "Nope." The laughter faded, and Reaper's expression hardened. "You know those guys aren't going to let this go, right?" Frank nodded. "I know." Crusher wasn't the kind of man who took humiliation lightly. The way Frank had stood his ground, called in help, flipped the tables on them in an instant. It had carved a wound into Crusher's pride that wouldn't heal easy. "He's a fool," Reaper muttered, "but a fool with a lot of dumb muscle behind him." Frank glanced at the convoy of Ghost Company men, still standing alert, waiting for orders. He could feel the energy shifting. They had been here for him, but now that the immediate threat had left, they were waiting to see what came next. He didn't want them tangled up in this. "This ain't your fight," Frank said. Reaper scoffed, crossing his arms. "You're outnumbered, your truck was busted, and you're standing in the middle of nowhere, playing chicken with a gang that thinks it's got something to prove. And you think I'm just gonna drive off and let you handle this alone?" Frank gave him a long, measured look. "I handled worse." Reaper sighed, rubbing a hand down his beard. "Yeah, and you also almost got yourself buried out here tonight." A slow gust of wind swept through, whistling against the rusted sign of the Viper's Nest bar. The lights inside flickered, but the bar itself was eerily silent. The locals had been watching. Frank could feel their eyes from behind the dusty windows. They had seen men like Crusher before, and they had never seen anyone stand up to him and walk away. "You know," Reaper mused, looking out over the empty highway, "we could make this real easy. You say the word and my guys will make sure those bastards don't even make it past the next county line." Frank didn't flinch. There had been a time, a long time ago, when he would have said yes without hesitation, when he would have made sure that a problem stayed buried. But that wasn't who he was anymore. "They'll come back," Frank admitted. "They always do." Reaper nodded. "Then let's make sure they regret it." Frank looked up at him, brow furrowing slightly. "What are you thinking?" Reaper grinned, the kind of grin that usually meant someone was about to have a really bad night. "They think they run this part of the desert. They think they're the big dogs." Reaper gestured to the convoy behind him, to the men who had spent their lives in war zones, in shadows, in places these bikers couldn't even imagine. "I say we remind them what real wolves look like." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Damn it, Reaper. I was hoping to have a quiet night." "Then you should have stayed home." Frank sighed, stretching his shoulders before stepping away from the truck. "Guess I better get to work." Reaper clapped him on the back. "Damn right." As the men of Ghost Company started moving, Frank watched the horizon, the empty road stretching toward the unknown. He had spent his whole life fighting battles that weren't supposed to be his. And yet, here he was again. Maybe, he thought, some men just weren't meant for peace. The night hung heavy over the desert, a blanket of darkness interrupted only by the distant glow of headlights bouncing off the cracked pavement. They were coming back. Frank Delaney stood by his truck, arms crossed, his old Marine jacket shifting in the cool night breeze. He could feel it in his bones, the way the air seemed to tense, the way the silence tightened like a noose. Some men were born for war, and some never got the chance to leave it behind. Reaper stood beside him, cracking his knuckles, his grin barely visible in the dim light. "They won't just roll in like last time," he said. They'll come harder, angrier. They'll bring their whole damn crew, looking to prove something. Frank nodded, his jaw tight. Good. Let's teach them a lesson they won't forget. The Ghost Company had already taken their positions, hidden in the darkness, spread out along the edges of the abandoned road. Their bikes and trucks were parked in the shadows, engines cooled, waiting. No roaring, no revving, no intimidation tactics. Crusher's boys thought they ran the desert. They were about to find out who really did. The sound came first, a deep rolling thunder, a storm of engines growing louder with each second. Frank watched the horizon as 20, maybe more, headlights cut through the night. The Black Reapers were back. At the front, Crusher led the pack, his broken pride fueling his need for vengeance. Frank could imagine him now, gripping the handlebars with white-knuckled rage, his mind focused on one thing, payback. But he didn't know. He didn't know what waited for him in the dark. The convoy of bikers roared into the lot outside the Viper's Nest, their headlights casting long, wicked shadows against the sand and asphalt. Their boots hit the ground in a symphony of leather and steel, their weapons glinting under the dull neon glow of the flickering bar sign. Crusher dismounted first, his face twisted in anger. "Where's the old bastard?" he snarled. Frank stepped into the light. "You came all this way," Frank said, his voice calm, steady, like he had been expecting them all along. "You boys lost again?" Crusher's men chuckled, but there was an unease now, a hesitation. They couldn't see who else was out there. Only Frank. That should have scared them more than it did. "You made me look weak," Crusher growled, stalking forward, his fists clenched. "Made my men look weak." Frank tilted his head, unimpressed. "Number, you did that yourself." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment, there was silence. Then Crusher pulled his gun. A small, cruel smile played at Frank's lips. "Bad idea." A light snapped on in the darkness, then another, then 3 more. The Ghost Company stepped out from the shadows, weapons already raised, red dot sights painting the bikers in eerie, glowing specks. Some held rifles, modified, military grade. Others just stood with the confidence of men who had done this before. Because they had. Crusher froze. His men stumbled back, eyes darting, finally realizing what they had walked into. Frank didn't move. "You think this is your world," Frank said, his voice carrying through the dead air. "But you never had control. You just bullied people too scared to fight back." Crusher's gun wavered. His men weren't standing tall anymore. Reaper stepped forward, his face unreadable. "Here's the deal. You leave your bikes, you walk, and you never come back." Crusher's face twisted in rage, humiliation. "You think—" Frank cut him off. "You're not walking away with pride, son. You're walking away alive. That's all you get." The bikers looked at each other, uncertainty finally breaking them. Some of them started slowly backing away, hands raised, stepping off their bikes. Others hesitated, weighing what was left of their loyalty against the reality of the situation. Crusher stood there, breathing heavy, his shoulders rising and falling. Frank stared him down, unblinking. Then, with a slow exhale, Crusher dropped his gun. One by one, the Black Reapers walked away from their bikes, their boots crunching against gravel. They disappeared into the night, fading into nothing. The engines of the Ghost Company roared to life. Reaper turned to Frank, smirking. "I'd say that went well." Frank nodded. "Could have been worse." As the last of the Black Reapers vanished into the darkness, Frank turned toward his truck, rolling his shoulders, feeling the weight of another battle won, but never really over. Because he knew, some fights never end. And if they ever came back, he'd be waiting. The end.